Good afternoon, good morning. For those joining us today for our webinar, second webinar with Victoria Bagnall and teacher. Today's webinar, we are talking about psychological safety, what teachers need to know about stress, safety, and the developing brain. Victoria kindly joined us last month for a fantastic webinar about handling parents and difficult conversations. And we've had such wonderful feedback from last month's webinar. So please do go and view that on YouTube. Really, really insightful, and I think so much to follow up on. I'm sure Victoria will touch on elements of that today. But if we are ready, Victoria, I think let's begin.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. It's wonderful to be here, and welcome to everyone in the audience. Stephanie, I wonder if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the Menti into the chat. I can't seem to access the chat myself,
Yes.
but that would be really helpful. And then people will be able to click on that link and be able to get access to the interactive nature of today's presentation. Okay, so let's get started. So you're here at the right webinar. We're talking about psychological safety today, what teachers need to know about stress, safety, and the developing brain. So in this session, we're going to explore 5 key lessons about brain function, how psychological safety impacts learning and behaviour, 5 protective states and how to recognise them, how to provide psychologically safe learning environments. And you'll take away clear explanations you can share with your colleagues and students, a lens to reframe some tricky behaviours and patterns, practical strategies to support learners and staff affected by psychological safety, and a compassionate approach to learning behaviour and attendance challenges. So let's get started. So as Stephanie said, this is an interactive presentation. You will have been sent a link in your emails, which is wonderful. But also you can access it using a QR code scanner. So that's you can open your phone camera and scan the QR code, or if you're on an internet browser, you can just go to www.menti.com and type in the code 7417 5718. So that's 7417.
The link, Victoria, is in the question Q&A. If you have a look at answered questions and Q&A, the link's now there as well.
Brilliant. That's super. And so the link's also in the answered questions in the Q&A, so you can click on it there as well. The instructions to join will be at the top of all the interactive slides. So if anyone does join later, they'll be able to join that way as well. Super. Fantastic. Amazing. Wonderful. It's lovely to have you all online with me today. So I always like to just start and check that the Menti is working. So I'd like you to describe the children you support in 3 words. So this is just a nice, quick, easy exercise where we've got to choose 3 adjectives to describe the children you support. This can be anything, any words that pop to mind, and that will create a nice word cloud for us on the screen. It's just really to check that we've got the Menti working and to you to see how interactive it is. So choosing 3 words to describe the young people you support. Wonderful. So very interesting to see. We've got courageous, caring, happy, fun, energetic, spirited, then puberty stage, adolescence, kind, fun, inquisitive, energetic, smart, opinionated, creative, but lovely to see curious and caring coming out top there, and then energetic and inquisitive as well. Diverse coming up as well in the chat as well. Fantastic. Lovely to see. Lovely to see. Lovely to see all these words. And I think this helps us to remind us why we do this work, why we work, which we choose to spend our time working alongside young people and helping them to be the best humans that they can be. And that's because we get to work with these wonderful, inquisitive, curious, caring young people who are super energetic and probably energize us as well as adults around them. So thank you so much for sharing that. So a little bit of an introduction to me and why I'm here speaking to you about psychological safety. So my name is Victoria Bagnall, and I am neurodivergent. I have a diagnosis of dyslexia, but I also have ADHD and ASD traits as well. So autism and ADHD traits too. But despite all of that, I did manage to get to the University of Cambridge to read geography, and I'm a qualified secondary geography teacher. So I've walked the walk, I know what it's like. I'm also a mother of three girls. I've got a 14-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And I'm also the co-founder of Connections in Mind, the organisation I'm speaking of on behalf of today, the Code, which offers executive function aware tutoring. I am a trustee of the Learning Skills Trust, which is a charity based in the UK focusing on learning skills. And I am an advisor to the Divergent Schools Group, which is a group of schools within schools providing education for neurodivergent young people. I've also just founded an organisation called the International Executive Function Coaching Certification, which certifies executive function coaches globally. And I've written a book which comes out in August. It's called The Neuro-Inclusive Educator, and it's everything that teachers need to know about how to provide inclusive classroom environments where every learner can thrive. So I always start these talks by talking a little bit about my light bulb moment, about the moment when I learned about executive function and how the brain actually works and how it completely transformed my life. And I'm hoping that some of you online or listening to this recording will be having some light bulb moments as we go through today as well. So because I'm neurodivergent, I struggled with repeated crisis throughout my late childhood and early adulthood. I had been led to believe that I was not the best human, that I wasn't good enough because I'd had lots of negative feedback from the adults around me as I was growing up. And that really impacted my mental health and meant that I suffered periods of suicidal ideation and severe depression. And I know statistically, the number of people we had signed up to this webinar, a number of you will have gone down that road too. And it's a really difficult space to be, struggling to find the way out, struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I'm glad to say that since I've had my light bulb moment, I haven't been down that road again. And that's because I now understand more about how my brain works and I'm able to be kinder to myself about what I find hard. So my light bulb moment came when I was working alongside a young lady who got the highest ever score in the thinking skills assessment for Oxford University. So I think we'll all agree that she's very bright, but she really struggled to do basic things like writing essays, handing in homework, organizing her files, just the things that we might think, oh, she's just being lazy if she's so intelligent, why can't she do these things? And I was supporting her as a private tutor, working with her in hospital, where she had been hospitalized to protect her because of her mental health. And I was helping her to get her A levels. And she was incredibly bright, incredibly gifted, and achieved her 3 A stars, as she should. But I was so curious to me that how someone so bright could struggle with the basic things in life. And I asked the psychiatrist who was working alongside me when we were supporting her, and I said, why is it this? Doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem logical. And she recommended this book, Smart but Scattered Teens, and I recommend it on to you. It's a fantastic book about executive functioning and all the things that we need to know about how the brain gets things done, as we'll come on to later. And it really transformed my life. It really helped me to see things from a completely different lens. And it was when I finished reading this book that I thought, this is something big. We need to have this in England. And I jumped on a plane over to America and I went to a course with the author of the book, took her out for lunch. And I said to Peg Dawson, who's pictured here, Peg, we really need you to come to England. Will you come to England and train people in England in executive functions? And that was almost 11 years ago now. Amazing, back in 2015. And since then, Peg and I have worked together. She's become a bit of a mentor of mine, and we have set up the International Executive Function Coaching Certification together. And she's one of our advisors on that. So it's been a huge part of my life going forward, and I'm hoping to share some of that passion with you today. So at Connections in Mind, we know that when we can educate people about how our brains really work, that has the power to change the world. So as an organization, we have this mission to change the world, to literally change the way that we interact as humans. So we offer executive function coach training, neurodiversity training and talks, and coaching and admin support. So anything that resonates with you today, that you think, oh, I want to learn more about that, we can support you in learning more or developing yourself. So we're going to start off with our first module, and our first module is 5 lessons about the brain. Now, this is adapted from Lisa Feldman Barrett's 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, which is a fantastic book, and I really encourage all teachers to read it. It's very short, it's accessible, and it's all the latest neuroscience about how the brain actually works. But these are 5 lessons that I've taken from that, and a couple that I've kind of put together so that it makes it a little bit more accessible in terms of a presentation. So just to say, the reason why we have Lisa's book and all this new knowledge that perhaps you didn't learn about when you were at school is that in the last 30 years or so, we've only just had the technology called fMRI scanners to be able to scan live brains and see what the brain is doing and how it functions. And that has completely opened up this new area of science called neuroscience, which just probably didn't exist when a lot of us were in school. So, whilst we're going to be talking about neuroscience, a lot of this we do kind of know instinctively or just from the science that we learned, this is kind of basic, and I want to build on that. So let's remind ourselves from our science education, what is the primary function of our brains? Why is it evolved? What does it evolve to do in our bodies? It's not a trick question. Thank you. Absolutely. It's all about survival. Okay, so our brain has evolved to keep us from dying. That's its primary function. Okay, and then probably the next thing is procreation after that. And all the other things kind of come as secondary and they can kind of help with those 2 things. But that's the primary function of our brain, to survive, to keep us alive. And sometimes I think we forget about that because we live in societies where the risk of death is so kind of far removed from us. But we still have a lot of the way that our brain works. It's based on when we were kind of quite primitive humans, and the risk of death was much, much higher. So that's how our brains have evolved for survival. So the lesson 1 is our brain prioritizes survival. So we'll always prioritize keeping us safe. That is what it will always default to. And also balancing something called the body budget, which is basically managing the energy levels within our body so that we are working in the most sustainable and efficient way. And that helps us to survive longer because the more efficiently we're using our energy sources, the more likely we are to survive over the longer term. So constantly balancing that body budget and prioritizing our survival. There's 2 parts to lesson 2. Firstly, that there are 100 billion neurons in our brain. So 100 billion tiny microscopic neurons that are connected together in a web of neurons through the axon terminals connecting with the dendrites of each neuron, as we've demonstrated here in this diagram. So it's a mind-boggling number of neurons that we have in our brains. And to add to that, from before we are born, everything we experience shapes our brain. Okay, so every single thing that we come across, everything we experience shapes how our brain functions. We are so adaptable to our environments. There is a genetic predisposition, but what we experience absolutely shapes our brain. That's why you can have identical twins who have different characters and personalities and skills and talents, because the experiences that those individuals will have shaped their brains differently, even though they have exactly the same genetics. So it's really important for us as educators to understand how malleable the brain is and how little brains are developed. Lesson 3 is that because our environment shapes our brain, and there are 100 billion neurons in our brains, there are literally trillions of different ways that a human brain can be wired. So therefore, there is only one certainty about brain development, and that is diversity. That every single human being on this planet will think and behave in different ways. And that is what humanity is all about. Okay, there is no such thing as normal brain development and abnormal brain development. That has been in the science rejected a long time ago. We're still grappling with it in society, but it's really important that we as educators understand there is no such thing as normal brain development, just diversity. Lesson 4, we're almost done with our 5 lessons now, but lesson 4 is that brains work by predicting, not reacting. So you may think that you're constantly reacting to your environment, but actually the brain is a really good predictor. It's constantly looking for patterns of things that have come before and following the neural pathways that it's developed, because that saves energy on the body budget. So for example, if I was to stand up now, my body will prepare for me to stand up and change my blood pressure before I actually stand up. It won't wait for me to stand up and then get dizzy before it changes my blood pressure. It will do all that by predicting. Okay, so as we experience things in the world from when we're first born, in fact, from before we are born, everything is feeding back to us and predicting the patterns of how our world and our environment works. And so when things are routine and predictable, the brain likes that often because it's reducing the tax on the body budget. It's taking less energy because we're not having to fire off new neural pathways and create new ways of thinking about things. So the brain much prefers to work in this kind of predictable route rather than reacting to new stimuli. And finally, and very most importantly, lesson 5 is that brains are socially connected. Okay, we are not individuals. We are part of a social organism that is humanity and our communities, and schools are social communities. And we are constantly co-regulating with the other humans in our physical space and also in our mental space as well, the people that we think about. Okay, so we're constantly in tune with each other. Now, remember, these 5 lessons are facts from the neuroscience. Okay, this is not it's not something kind of we've dreamt up. These are things that are irrevocable facts from the neuroscience. So let's just recap about these. So the first one is that the brain is primed for survival and balancing that body budget to making sure that we're being as most efficient with using our energy in our bodies. Little brains wire to their worlds, so they're shaped by everything that happens to them. All brains are different. No 2 human brains function in the same way. And brains predict, not react. So they're constantly looking for patterns and constantly predicting what might happen next. And finally, brains are social organs. They do not exist in a vacuum. They are connected with the other humans around them. So let's move on to psychological safety and the brain now. So psychological safety significantly impacts the functioning of the brain, because if the brain senses any type of threat, then it will shift into protective mode in order to keep the body safe. Remember, it's the primary function of the brain is always survival. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 key areas of the brain right now. Okay, we're going to keep this very complex organ as simple as possible for the purposes of understanding what we're learning today. So we have 2 areas. We have the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the bit of our brain behind our forehead, which is where we think before we act. Okay, it's the air traffic control center. It allows us kind of that higher order thinking, the learning, social engagement, all of that kind of stuff. Now, we also have a part of our brain called the amygdala. Our amygdala is like our threat detector. And when our amygdala senses any type of threat, we act before we think. Okay, so when the amygdala senses a threat or a pattern that has been threatful in the past, because remember, it's always predicting what might happen next, we act before we think. We have an instinctive response. So I want to talk to you now about executive functions. That's my specialist area. And I'm very excited at the moment because the UK government has just announced that executive functions are now one of the 5 key areas of child development that they are focusing on in the UK. So if you haven't heard of that term before, you're going to be hearing about it a lot more in education fields, especially in British international education. So executive functions are the cognitive processes, which means what the brain is doing, associated with the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Okay, so it's that air traffic control center of the brain, and it's what the brain does in that part of the brain. They're called executive functions because they're responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks and emotional regulation. So it's all about getting things done and executing tasks. That's what the prefrontal cortex is responsible for. We need executive functions for learning. And every single human on this planet has a unique executive function skills fingerprint. So they have strengths and challenges, but also it changes depending on how safe they're feeling, how stressed, how tired, if the body budget is out of balance and needs to be shifted back again. So what does this mean for our lives? What are our executive functions? Let's dig into this a little bit more before we get on to how psychological safety impacts them. So first of all, it's about meeting deadlines, prioritizing our work, regulating our emotions, inhibiting our responses, so that's stopping ourselves from doing something we instinctively want to do, organizing our belongings, organizing our thoughts on paper, holding information in our heads, that's our working memory, keeping time. Now, this is a really interesting one internationally because different cultures have very different relationships with time and punctuality. In the UK, we're obsessed with it, but in other parts of the world, it doesn't have such a cultural standing. Thinking flexibly as well is another part of executive functioning. So I want you to reflect on yourself. Which of these things do you find hard? Now, if you've just joined us, because I can see there's a few more people than online, who on Menti that are online. If you have just joined us, please do get involved. So you can go to menti.com on an internet browser and type in the code there, 7417 5718, or you can scan the QR code here on the screen. So you can select as many of these things as you like. And it's going to create a little wheel of our skill sets here. We've got 5 out of 25 who have responded. Let's get a few more before I start commentating on what we can see. And in the meantime, I'll have a sip of my tea. Fabulous. Okay, I can see a few more people joining. Thank you. If you are online, I do encourage you to get involved in the Menti. It's great fun and really help deepen our learning. Super. Okay, so just over half of us have responded. And look at that. In a group of highly educated, high achieving people who are working in international schools across the world, we struggle with these things. We find these things hard. Okay. And that's because having executive function challenges is a natural, normal part of being a human, and everyone has their own fingerprint. And this is what this slide shows us. It's interesting to see that prioritizing our work is coming out top. Now, we're all teachers and we've all got a crazy workload that we have to keep on top of, so it's not surprising that that's the case. But also holding information in our heads as well as coming out top. As well as meeting deadlines. Again, all the report writing that we have to do and keeping on top of our workload as teachers can be super challenging. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope this illustrates that everyone in the world struggles with their executive functions to some extent. So at Connections in Mind, we work with 11 executive function skills. And we talk about 3 brain processes, which is what the scientists recognize the prefrontal cortex does. So that's our working memory, our inhibitory control, and our cognitive flexibility. Those are the 3 brain processes. And then there are these 11 executive function skills. So we've got things like goal-directed persistence, which is the same as resilience or grit. We've got metacognition. We've got emotional regulation. We've got task initiation, sustained attention, organization, planning and prioritization. I'm just going to take a couple of these to go through how they're linked with the brain function. So let's think of resilience or goal-directed persistence. That's a hot topic in education at the moment. We need more resilient young people who can pick up the telephone and go outside in the real world and be strong and resilient. So how do we do that? Well, they need to have the working memory to hold in mind whatever they're working towards. They need their inhibitory control not to get distracted and go off and scroll on TikTok or disappear on social media or YouTube. And then they need the cognitive flexibility to shift and change their thinking when the inevitable obstacle arises. Because let's face it, whilst the brain would love it to be predictable, the world is not predictable. It's constantly changing and shifting. And we need that cognitive flexibility to be able to shift and change our thinking onto a different neural pathway to solve our problems. So you can see how for goal-directed persistence, we need those three brain functions. Let's think about metacognition. That's another hot topic in education at the moment, being self-aware and aware of our learning. So in order to be metacognitive, to have that self-awareness, we need our working memory to remember what has happened. And then we need our cognitive flexibility to manipulate that information and see it from a different perspective. That's metacognition. So we can see how these brain functions impact these skills. And as schools, we're really good at measuring skills and developing skills. And so that's something we can focus on doing as teachers. So just reminding ourselves that that prefrontal cortex, which is where the executive function is housed, is our air traffic control center. It's where we think before we act. And then we have our amygdala, our threat detector, which if it senses any patterns that cause it to predict that there's going to be a threat, then we act before we think. We go into our survival mode and we preserve the body. That's what the brain is primary function of the brain is for survival. So I'm going to show you this cool hand model of the brain now. I'm going to stop my screen sharing for a second while I show it to you. So if you see like this, you put your hand up. You can see my daughter's little bracelet that she made me here. She's 6, bless her. So what we do is put our hand up like this and we fold our thumb across the palm of our hand. And then we've got this knobbly bit of our thumb that sticks out. So this is our amygdala. And then we've got our cortex and our prefrontal cortex like this. So this is our hand model of the brain here. Now, what happens is that if we are relaxed and feeling calm and the brain doesn't predict any kind of threat, then we have our prefrontal cortex engaged. We can access our executive functions. We can use our executive function skills. We can learn, we can engage in play, we can do all the things that we need to do in school. But if our amygdala senses any type of threat, whether real or perceived, we flip our lids and our prefrontal cortex goes offline and our amygdala prioritizes our survival networks in our brain. We'll talk more about those in a minute. But we flip our lids and we are not able to access our prefrontal cortex. We're not able to do the learning that we need to do. We're not able to engage socially. We shut down, we freeze, we fly, whatever it is that we do. We'll come on to that in a minute. It's really important to remember that when the brain senses any type of threat, whether real or perceived, it takes milliseconds for this to happen. And on average, about 20 minutes for that prefrontal cortex to come back online when the amygdala senses patterns of safety. Okay, when it predicts safety. So it's really important for us to remember this functionality of the brain because that helps us to understand why children, some can act in irrational ways and can do things that we wouldn't normally predict that they would do. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. And I should just say, actually, you can use this hand model of the brain with colleagues, you can use it with students, you can use it all the way down into kind of preschool. It's such a fantastic tool. We use it at home all the time. When my husband and I have had a little discussion about things, maybe, and things have got a bit heated, we'll go to each other after. So I'm really sorry I flipped my lid. This happened, that happened. I got really triggered by something you said or did, and we're able to reflect on that. So it's a really great tool to use, that hand model of the brain. So here are the 5 ways that the brain can respond. Now, it's not 5 kind of unique siloed ways, but this is the way that we categorize things because humans like to be able to predict things. They like to be able to categorize. So there's fight, flight, and freeze. Now, you've probably heard of those ones already, but a lot of people haven't heard of flop, which is when we fall to the floor in distress, perhaps when we're younger. Often you'll see it in a class where a student just leans back in their chair, they've kind of given up. And also it's that kind of fainting response too. We'll come on to the difference between flop and freeze. Thank you so much in a minute. But freeze is more like when we kind of clam up and we can't get anything out, whereas flop is where more like we've given up on everything. Our body goes floppy, whereas freeze is more that kind of rigid response. And then fawn is when we comply with whatever the threat is. So our brains learn that when we comply with some kind of threat, if someone yells at us and tells us something to do something, we're really scared and we do it, then that threat goes away. So our brain has learned that when we comply with whatever the threat is, then that can keep us safe in certain environments. So that fawn response, often teachers mistake that for obedience. But actually, it's a protective response. It's a survival response that is showing that that child is not able to learn and is not settled and calm in that environment. So we need to be really aware of that fawn response. It's also really important to remember that trauma impacts executive functioning too. So if a child has experienced psychological trauma in their formative years, whether that is because they've been adopted and taken away from their birth parents, whether it's because they've suffered from physical or verbal abuse or psychological abuse, whether it's they've been bullied, anything that has impacted them in a traumatic way will impact the development of their prefrontal cortex and their ability to use their executive functioning. Okay, so we've learned a lot in that module. So let's just recap on it. So executive functioning is needed for learning. We need our prefrontal cortex online in order to learn. But when the brain feels unsafe, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. Physical or psychological threats, both real and perceived, can cause threat responses. And we can categorize 5 threat responses. We've got fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flop. Okay. So let's now look at how this plays out in your context, because that's what's really important. And we'll get on to some strategies for you to use. So let's just remind ourselves of these 5 Fs. Then we've got fight. So this can be when a child physically fights and they get physical and violent. But it can also be when a child gets really defensive and shouts. Or is snarky and sarcastic in their responses. Flight, so that can be physically running away from a situation. So you see them disappear across the playground. But it can also be things like asking to go to the toilet, not turning up in school on days when they have a lesson that they don't like or a teacher that they don't like. That's a flight response. Freeze is when they clam up and they become quite rigid. And so often that's when you put them on the spot in a lesson, you cold call them, do you know the answer to this question? And they don't know the answer to this question and they go into a freeze response. They can't get anything out. Then we've got that fawn response. So that's when you or another child might get angry, raise their voice at them, or might use other kind of coercive behaviours in order to get them to do something, and they fall into line. And they exhibit what we call kind of people-pleasing type behaviours. Often it is with this kind of body language that they're kind of like, oh, yes, of course, because they're kind of defending themselves and they're trying to keep themselves safe. So that's the fawn response. Then we have the flop response, which is where a child falls to the ground in distress, or they sit back in their chair and they kind of flop, they've given up, or they might faint as well. So I would like to know, on the Mentimeter, please, what types of challenging behaviour do you see in your setting? Just write down any case studies, mini case studies of challenging behaviour you see in your setting. Could have been things that I mentioned on the previous slide or other things. Best if it's other things, because then we can try and categorise them. Okay, so a lack of motivation in students. Okay, so let's be more specific about the specific behavior that you're seeing in that particular moment. So, what is it that you're specifically seeing? They are checking out of the work, etc., etc. So, let's be really specific. Okay. Okay. Right, super. So as we see these coming in, if you see one on your screen, on your a Menti that you like, you can upvote it. And then we're going to discuss the ones that get the most votes today. Okay. So if you see any that you particularly like that you want to answer that anyone else has put on there, you can start. You can vote on them. Oh, I have to press a button to get you to vote on them. So let's just see what we've got coming up here. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. I thought it happened simultaneously. This is a new feature on Menti that I'm trying out, so apologies. But I'll give it a couple more seconds and we'll see what we've got. Okay. All right. Fantastic. Okay, so students moving around and can't focus on learning. Okay, so what type of response do we think that is? You've got the chat function on the Mentimeter. You can just put your ideas on there. What type of response of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or flop? Which is it most closely related to? A student moving around and can't focus on learning. What is that most closely linked to? Any ideas? You can put it in the chat function on the Menti if you like. If you haven't got any ideas, I'll give you an answer in a minute. It is a flight response. Yes, it's flight. Fantastic. Well done, everyone. That's a flight response. A freeze. We've had this one. This is answered. The freezing. A child having trouble answering questions. We see that all the time, don't we? What about a lack of motivation in students? What is that? That could be a couple of them, couldn't it? A lack of motivation in students. They just don't see the point. Flop and freeze. Yeah. Flop and freeze could also be a bit of flight as well. Because, sometimes it's easier not to try to do something, to avoid something, than to try and do it and fail at it. It feels easier, but that flop, that apathy. Okay. Defiant. If somebody is defiant, what might that be? If somebody is defiant, what kind of response is that? Fight. Yes, it's a fight response. Super. Okay, a student who takes another student's pencils and breaks them. What's that one? Again, it's that fight response, isn't it? A student running around campus screaming after an argument with classmates. I think this is a combo of two as well. Yep, it's flight, but I think there's a bit of fight in there as well, like that aggression, the screaming. Often flight is when they disappear and you don't see them anymore. They go out of sight. Saying I don't care when faced with academic consequences. Another one's just come up, saying I don't care. That again is a flop response. So thank you so much for all of these. So you can see how we can start categorizing these responses as evidence that that child is not feeling safe. Okay, because when we're seeing these kind of challenging behaviors, it's not that the child is choosing that behavior, it's that the brain has gone into a survival response, a protective response to keep that body safe and to remove the threat. And it may be a maladaptive one that you don't want to see, that's not helpful to the student, but in the past it has helped them to avoid that threatful situation, to get away from that threatful situation, to protect themselves. So when we can start then decoding these behaviors as protective responses, it shifts our lens away from judgment that this child is naughty and defiant and we must punish them, into, oh my goodness, what's going on for this child? What are they communicating to us? Is feeling unsafe about school, about what we're asking to do them. Saying, I don't care, a flight response. No, they're not being defiant. No. Okay, so I really don't believe there's any child that is purposefully defiant. It's always a protective behavior that their brain has learned will keep them safe. So they have learned that that is the way to interact with anything that feels scary and threatful, is to say that they don't care, because it's too much risk for them to make an attempt to do it and fail, because they have perhaps a perfectionist mindset or whatever it is. I don't want to get too much into the specific psychology of each individual child, but I really encourage you to reframe this idea of these naughty, defiant children. They are all struggling with something and their brains are trying to protect them from a threat. They're not feeling psychologically safe. So let's look at what we can do now. Okay. What works with fight? So do lower your voice and language and offer two clear choices. So come with me for a walk, or let's just take a break and let's take a break and sit quietly in the corner. Give them two clear choices, not a punishment and that kind of choice, but two choices about how to diffuse the situation. And then give them space and time. They need that 20 minutes to get that prefrontal cortex back online. Then we've got the don'ts. So this is really important. When a child is dysregulated, when they're in that protective response, if you try and argue or reason with them, you're trying to talk to the amygdala, and it doesn't do rational thought. That's the prefrontal cortex. You've got to let the prefrontal cortex come back online. So don't argue or reason in the moment. Don't use consequences as threats. You'll just make them even more into that protective state because you're threatening them again. You're pushing them out of that psychological safety. And don't demand eye contact or apologies in that moment, okay? Because what you'll be then is pushing them into a fawn response, okay? Again, another protective response. It might feel like it's working, but it's not, because remember, it takes about 20 minutes for that prefrontal cortex to come back online. Flight. So what works for flight? Do allow planned exits or breaks. So allow children to go into another space if they're finding things that are too overwhelming. Have that set up as a system within your school. If there's often children who are neurodivergent really struggle with sensory input, so flickering lights, loud noises, etc. So we can reduce that sensory input in ways, so we can turn down lights, we can give them a corridor pass so that they can move to their next lesson before the other children, all sorts of different things. And then we can also shrink the task, so make it less overwhelming, break it down into chunks. But what we mustn't do is block the escape physically and trap them, because they're going to feel even more threatened in that moment and become even more dysregulated in their protective state. Insist that they stay and try, okay? If a child is already here, you're not going to be getting them to do the learning that they need to do. They need to spend that time getting back that prefrontal cortex back online so that they can re-engage their prefrontal cortex and their learning brain and get learning. And also don't question them publicly, okay? Because shame can be a huge threat to the brain, okay? If it feels any type of shame, it shuts down, or there's more flight or more freeze or more fight. So that psychological safety, shame really triggers that feeling of unsafety. What works with freeze? Do slow everything down, okay? So just really quieten everything down. If you can, sit nearby quietly, or if you're teaching the rest of the class, you can just stand by quietly, just recognizing that you're there, but with no particular pressure to do anything. And then also offering simple starters, breaking things down into chunks and just making it feel a bit more manageable. It's really important that we don't add pressure of rushing or countdowns. Okay. A lot of children have maths anxiety from kind of timed mental arithmetic. Okay. If you notice a child shutting down during mental arithmetic, remove the time pressure. Okay, time pressure is only a time it doing maths under time pressure is only one aspect of being able to do maths. Okay, so we need to make sure that we don't put that time pressure on if that's the thing that's causing the freeze response. Don't call them out publicly. Again, the shame can push them further into a protective state. And don't repeatedly ask, are you stuck again? You know, they're frozen. They can't do anything. So they need time for that prefrontal cortex to come online. They need to feel psychologically safe in order to do that. Fawn, what works? So do normalize mistakes. Okay. So fawn often comes around when you have a culture of perfectionism in the school where the teachers always seem to do things perfectly and they expect students to do things perfectly. And perfection is rewarded in assemblies, etc. And attendance perfection, you know, and academic perfection is always rewarded. Okay. So normalize mistakes. Mistakes are part of learning, and it's so important that we normalize them and that we show students that we're making mistakes, that we are human too. Discuss everyone's needs, okay? It's really important that we don't presume that adults' needs are more important than children's needs, okay? Children have needs too. They have human rights, and we need to respect their needs as well as the adult needs. And give private choices to young people who get stuck in a fawn response. They're kind of people pleasers. So make sure that we give them choices about how to prioritize what works for them as a human, and not to put other people's needs first, which is what fawners often do. We mustn't overpraise compliance, making sure that we praise up autonomy and independence and thinking for ourselves. We mustn't reward people pleasing. So we mustn't create a culture where students are constantly trying to please adults without thinking about how it impacts them as humans. And we mustn't expect instant agreement from students. Give them time to think about, does this fit with my values and what I want to do? And give them choices, give them autonomy, because young people really need that autonomy. And this is often the hardest one for schools to work on, because often we work in schools on a compliance mindset that children just must comply with adults. But actually all we get in that situation is a load of people pleasers. And there's a lot of therapists out there making a lot of money from unraveling people-pleasing cultures that we develop in our schools. So it's really important that we give them more autonomy over their lives as humans. And finally, flop. Flop, what works? Do check their basic needs first, okay? Because they may have fainted because of something, like they're dehydrated or they have overheated or whatever it is. You can lower your expectations temporarily to allow them to just give them space and just again offer that calm presence. It's really important when a child is showing that flop response, we don't stay fixed. We've got to show that we are shifting to accommodate the fact that they are communicating, that they're overwhelmed by emotion. Don't compare them to their peers and say, oh, Sally's not doing that. Why are you doing that? Everyone else is getting on with their work. That increases shame and puts them more into a protective state. And don't label them as lazy or disengaged, okay? Because if you label them as that tells the brain, okay, that's what I am. And it kind of is that prediction, okay, I am this kind of flop response. This is what I do. And then it becomes embedded in the brain. So don't label them as that. It's really important that we recognize this as a protective state and we support them to develop the skills, the executive function skills, to use that cognitive flexibility to shift their thinking so that they shift from thinking, I'm no good at this, I don't care, to actually, I do care about this and I want to do well and I know I'm going to get support from my teachers. And that requires a lot of executive function skills, especially cognitive flexibility to do that. So it's really important. The key principles of this are connect, collaborate, support. It's really important that we remember these 3 steps. So we've got to connect with the child, get their prefrontal cortex back online, which takes about 20 minutes. And then we've got to collaborate and work alongside them rather than telling them what to do. That prevents that kind of fawn response. And then we have to support them and support their development as the individual, diverse human that they are, not trying to get them to be something that they're not there authentically themselves. It's also really important to note that all of these things impact executive functioning too. So while psychological safety and physical safety are absolutely like the core of this all, these other things can impact that too. So whether they've exercised recently, whether they feel connected and a sense of belonging, whether they've had fun recently and played, whether they feel joy, calm, whether they've had good enough sleep, whether they've eaten recently, all impact the body budget, which means that the prefrontal cortex was pulled offline in order for that body budget to be balanced again. So here are some tips about psychological safety and safeguarding. We must recognise in our safeguarding policy that psychological harm is a thing too, as well as physical harm. So ongoing fear, humiliation, exclusion or distress are safeguarding concerns, not just physical risk. Okay, so we must make sure that we have that in our safeguarding policies. We must also read all behaviour as communication, and we need to train our staff to respond with de-escalation and support, not punishment, and review environmental and relational triggers. And that will mean that we need to look at our behaviour policies as well. Felt safety needs to be actively monitored as well. We need to check in whether school feels safe, psychologically safe in their schools, with clear routes for pupils and families to voice and leadership oversight. So it's really important that we actively monitor psychological safety, because the more we monitor it, the more we can understand it, the more we can reduce feelings of not being safe in school, and the more we can improve learning and learning outcomes. Because when children are feeling unsafe, they can't learn, but when they're feeling safe and supported, when psychological safety is high, then they can do amazing, amazing things. So there's specialist training available to support with this, because you're probably thinking, my goodness, we've covered an awful lot in this hour. I've tried to put in everything kind of just to cover an introduction to all of this, but of course you need specialist training in order to have people who really know what they're doing within your school setting. So we have two routes. We have the neuro-inclusive classroom practice, which is a whole staff training to design classrooms that reduce threat, support regulation and meet diverse learning needs, so that every classroom can be a classroom of psychological safety. And then we also have executive function coach training, which is specialist training for staff to understand regulation, behaviour and learning, and to provide targeted support for those hard to reach children. So those are the two options for specialist training. I also cover all of this in my upcoming book. So I do encourage you to scan the QR code and get pre-ordering. There is an online ebook version, as well as you can order a hard copy as well, and it should arrive with you around the 13th of August, so in time for some summer reading. So I do encourage you to scan the QR code and order the book. So just finishing up now, this module, psychological safety in international schools. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. We must see behaviour as communication. Okay, there's no such thing as a naughty or defiant child. In fact, there's a child that's struggling and not feeling safe, and we need to see that behaviour as a communication of them feeling unsafe, and look at our environment, what's making them feel unsafe, rather than them needing to be fixed. We need to connect with young people, bring their prefrontal cortexes online. We need to collaborate with them and work alongside them. And we need to support them to develop their executive function skills. We mustn't shame or threaten children, because it just pushes them into feeling psychologically unsafe, and they're unable to learn when they're in that fawn state, which is what normally happens when we shame or threaten children. Psychological safety should be included in safeguarding policy, and specialist training is absolutely transformative. So it's really important to get involved in that. So I'd like to know from the audience, what's your main takeaway from today? What's the main thing that you're thinking, my goodness, I just didn't know this before? And this will help everyone else in their learning to consolidate their learning. So please do share. That'd be fantastic. I've got a couple more slides after that, and then we're going to finish up. So please share your main. Behaviour is communication. It really is. Yeah. How much time students need to get back to a calm state of mind? Yeah, around 20 minutes, much longer if they are still feeling unsafe. All behavior is communication. How long it takes the brain to regulate. It is a long time, isn't it? We need to build that into our systems within schools and not expect children to snap back in. If they snap back in, it's a fawn response. The do's for the different responses. It takes 20, yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? The mechanics and responses. There were 100 billion neurons in the brain. There are. Isn't that a mind-boggling number? I didn't know there were more F reactions than fight, flight, and freeze. Yes, that fawn one. It's a really uncomfortable one for educators because we actually rely on it a lot in our traditional education systems. But it's such an important one we get our heads round because we need to make sure that our children aren't being forced to mask because masking and neurodivergent masking is a type of fawn response. There are no abnormal normal brains. There really aren't. And we need to celebrate that wonderful human diversity. Fawning was new to you too, the 5 Fs. Students who don't feel safe may look like defiance. It may look like defiance because that's how we've labelled it in the past. But now we know better. We need to do better. Thank you so much. Wonderful responses. So just to remind you all, we are here to help. We're a non-profit organisation based in the UK, but we do training internationally across the world. So we're here and exist to support you in your learning and development. Each of our training programs comes with 4 levels of accreditation. So you start out with an entry level, then you move to a competent practitioner, then you move to a supervisor so you can start mentoring others. And then finally, you move on to training others as well. So lots of the school groups that we're working with internationally are training up a number of people at level 1, a smaller group at level 2, a smaller group even at level 3, and then 1 or 2 people at level 4 so that they can have this knowledge in-house and they can keep that knowledge base high. We offer the 2 routes. We've got the executive function coach training for schools. That's a specific course for schools where you get the International Executive Function Coach certification. And then we have the neuro-inclusive classroom practice, which is based on my book. We're on Facebook and Instagram. You can search for Connections in Mind, and I'm very active on LinkedIn, and there's lots going on LinkedIn at the moment around executive functioning. So do follow me on LinkedIn. I'd love to see you there. I'm just going to leave this up on the screen while we finish up because I do have a feedback form for you. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out for us, I'm just going to leave it up on the screen for you and your mentee whilst we're finishing up. I think there might be some questions.
We've also had a request to show your book info link again. So I said we will send it tomorrow in a follow-up email, Victoria. But yes, please do take a look at Victoria's book that she has launched, which is very exciting. And of course, you can get in touch with her directly. We will send, as I said, we will send the recording of the webinar tomorrow, which will be great. So you can, rewatch it again, share with colleagues, and all the important links and details, so you can get in touch and further your knowledge. Really, really interesting, Victoria, as always. I think as one of the learners was saying about fawning, something that I didn't know, and I think what's really handy is it's so useful, obviously, to learn the research, the theory behind everything, but also for us, teachers, is those do's and don'ts so key, because each one of those was, for each F, they were so different as well, and so we're faced with all these different situations, every single day, from as soon as they come in, from the bell to they go home, on their school bus and drop off. And it's, sort of being able to sort of have that toolkit ready to go, okay, I'm recognizing this type of behavior, rather than do this instant kind of reaction that I would sort of normally jump to as a habit. I'm going to try this. And so I think, having those sort of do's and don'ts really, really helpful. I'm sure a lot of people will be replaying that section and writing it down tomorrow and doing little screenshots. Really, really handy. But I think, for everybody, who's watching, please, if you've got any questions, please do write in the question box. I'm having a look. Yeah, please do write any questions now whilst we've got Victoria here. But if not, again, feel free to send us an email. You've got our contact details anyway, and you can ask Victoria some questions. I'm sure as soon as you'll go away and sort of have a cup of tea, you'll end up thinking of a million things to ask her.
We've got a couple, haven't we, already up here? So one about moving around, but I think Jason, maybe you were responding to the other thing on the slide,
Yes.
so we can just answer that one. But Sasha has said students excels academically, but behaviour during class is confrontational for no apparent reason. I'm patient and understanding, and I've tried everything, but I'm running out of options. Any tips? Okay. So first of all, let's work out what kind of response this is. So I think we'll all agree that a confrontational probably is a fight response. So the child is finding your classroom, for whatever reason, is not feeling psychologically safe. That feels threatful. So they're going into that fight response. Now, that can be for many different reasons. Maybe it's too easy or too hard, or there's so many different things. So without actually speaking to the student and saying, look, I've noticed there's a pattern, really trying to support you. Can you tell me what's feeling hard about my lessons? Because I really want to understand that. And just that question, please, can you tell me what's feeling hard? Can really start eliciting some information. Now, you might not feel able to do that yourself. You might get the pastoral lead or whoever it is, or safeguarding lead, to have that conversation. But without talking directly to the student, you'll always only be guessing. And that's why that collaborative approach is so important in this work, because without asking the student, we are very, very likely to get it wrong. And then we are constantly kind of fumbling around in the dark, trying to try things. But when we speak to them, first of all, they'll feel heard, as long as it's done in a non-confrontational way, and they'll feel supported. And then you can start then talking to them about the skills that they need to develop. So one of the things that they need to develop as well, alongside you changing your environment, is that they need to develop their response inhibition skills, which is one of their executive function skills. So rather than why are you being confrontational, it's upsetting the rest of the class, and for them to be like, oh my goodness, I'm just trying to communicate, and it all just feels like too much. Having that conversation where it's like, we've noticed you're really struggling with your response inhibition in this particular class. We'd like to really understand what's feeling hard for you about it, and we want to support you to develop your response inhibition. It's a totally different conversation, and it's much more likely to have the child in this part of their brain rather than like this. So I hope that helps, Sasha. But again, it's not something that I would recommend, that person having that conversation. You need training in order to have that conversation. It's not something you can just go at if you haven't had specific training, because it is complex and it's different from the way that we were educated. And I think that's what you mentioned earlier, Stephanie. This is the way that we instinctively do things is the way that we were educated, which has now been proven by the neuroscience to be harmful. And so we need to do things differently. And that requires training and development. And that's what the UK government has recognised in its recent white paper. And that's why they've named executive functioning as a separate area of human child development. And so it's really important that we upskill in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could literally be here every single day, all day, answering question after question. I was just thinking back to when I was teaching, and I was thinking, I was sort of doing the sort of replay of all the students in my class who were not problematic, that's not the word, but just, had little sort of nuances, or kind of the ones that didn't listen, or talking too much, or zoned out. And when you've got a class, I mean, we're fortunate in the international sector, we've got small classrooms, right? I mean, if you're teaching at somewhere like the UK or the US, you've got suddenly classrooms of sort of 30, 35 plus. But even with a class of 20, it's so difficult to sort of try and support each child who's got a different need, and sort of trying to get through that day or lesson, and sort of help somebody who maybe is chatting too much or being disruptive, whilst you've got another child who's completely zoned out and they're not able to focus. and of course there are reasons for this, and so it's it's we certainly salute the teachers, that's for sure, because we've just as
Yeah.
yourself, we've all been there, and I certainly I think would have appreciated your sort of advice and guidelines back then, that's for sure. But Victoria,
Just to say that particular question about how do I meet the needs of all these different
yeah,
children that are
yeah,
regulated in different ways is covered in the book. It's about having classroom routines that we use every day
yeah.
that help the students to identify their blockers to learning and what strategies work for them. So they are doing it. It's not about the teachers doing more. It's about the students learning more about themselves so that they can adapt their learning to what is being taught. That's the big difference.
No, exactly. All right. Well, you better get Victoria's book then. So I will. I will send the information to everybody tomorrow, and with the webinar. But it's as I said, last month's webinar as well. It's been really, really insightful, and as you said, today with the UK government, sort of acknowledging that things need to change in terms of how we're teaching children. It's great to see things progress, and also that we're sort of on top of it and really ahead of our game in terms of looking at things like executive functions and how to sort of incorporate them into our day-to-day teaching. So I think lots more to learn, I think, is the sort of plan, I think. But no, really, really great. And thank you so much. And as I said, I'm sure we will no doubt have Victoria on again sometime in the academic year. Lots and lots of topics to cover, and can go so much more in depth. So I will say good evening from Australia here, and good morning from Victoria in the UK. And we will send our follow-up tomorrow to you all. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.